The Miracle of the Seventh-Day Ox. The story of SDA pastor Nikolai Panchak in a Siberian prison for his faith. We begin today at chapter 8. He has just arrived at the prison and has spoken to the warden, and the story now continues. Nikolai couldn't believe his ears. That was it. No interrogation, no grilling to get long sought-after information from the preacher. This was too good to be true. It couldn't be that easy. And Nikolai was sure there would be future confrontations. As he turned to go, Nikolai suddenly remembered his biggest problem of all, the Sabbath. He would be required to work during Sabbath hours. That's what happened when you were a prisoner. Nikolai wondered, should he say something about it now, or wait until Saturday when the Sabbath would actually become an issue? Nikolai knew he'd better take care of it immediately while he still had the courage and the warden's attention. "Sir," Nikolai stopped and turned around. "There is one thing that may be a problem." But already, the warden had moved on to other things. "Remember, Panchak, no problems. Simply obey orders, and you and I will get along fine." And with that, the warden waved him out of the door. Nikolai stood for a few moments longer, wondering what he should do. But he realized there was no use pressing the issue now. The warden was in no mood to listen, and maybe it wasn't the right time for such a discussion anyway. God had his own timetable as to when these things should be taken care of, Nikolai mused. He knew he'd better let God work everything out as he saw best. "Help me to know when that time is," he silently prayed. Nikolai went looking for Vadim, the camp carpenter, and found him in the woodshop. Vadim still had the pungent odor of garlic on his breath, and the smell of it made Nikolai ravenous. Garlic was one of his favorite foods, and knowing that he had been deprived of breakfast made it twice as hard to go to work and wait for the midday meal. But Vadim had plenty for Nikolai to do, and that made him almost forget the grumbling, growling feeling in his stomach. The mess hall needed more wooden benches made. Then there were the few boards in the floor of the administrative headquarters that needed to be replaced, and a door at the mess hall needed mending. Lunch finally came. It was a simple one, but Nikolai didn't care. He was just glad to get something warm into his stomach. The cook had made borscht with beets, onions, and cabbage in it. It was the most heavenly food Nikolai could remember tasting. And the Russian black bread tasted like cake to Nikolai after his days on the train with so little to eat. That afternoon, Vadim told Nikolai they needed to repair some of the large wooden water barrels sitting near the kitchen. Each barrel held about 50 gallons of water and was made with oak staves. Nikolai had to tip them on their side to roll them back to the woodshop where Vadim would be making the repairs. On his trip back for the second barrel, Nikolai noticed that an ox cart had pulled up at the kitchen. The cart held 2 large wooden barrels filled with water hauled from a spring located more than half a mile away. Oleg, the driver of the ox cart, was shouting at the ox, trying to get him to pull the cart forward a bit more so that the water could be hauled inside the kitchen. But the ox wouldn't budge a step farther. Maybe the ox was tired from hauling the water, and maybe he was just being plain stubborn. Or maybe he was weary of the treatment he had been receiving from the driver. At any rate, it was obviously a showdown, and it seemed both the driver and the ox were determined to win. When the driver pulled out his leather prod and began to whip the ox in the face, Nikolai sprang into action. He knew it probably wasn't wise to get involved, since this was only his first day in the camp, but he couldn't bear to see the animal being mistreated. "Hold on," he called to the driver. "It's obvious the ox is too stubborn for his own good. Why don't we try something else?" Nikolai tried not to look at the driver. He was butting in where he might not be wanted, but he felt he had to try. "What's his name?" Nikolai asked nonchalantly as he stepped up to the ox and gave the animal a pat on his thick, muscled neck. "Maxim, I guess," the prisoner replied. "I never used that name, but it's his name." "Animals are like people," Nikolai said. "They like to be convinced to do something, not beaten into submission." Nikolai patted the ox's neck again and leaned forward to whisper something into its ear. Then he took hold of a halter around the ox's neck and pulled forward as he continued talking to the ox. The technique did the trick. In a matter of seconds, the ox had pulled the cart a short distance forward so the driver could unload the barrels and put them on pallets outside the kitchen. That night, after the evening meal, Nikolai went to the stables, where he found Maxim quietly munching on tundra marsh grass. Nikolai sat down beside the big animal and watched him eat. He felt sorry for him. In some ways, he thought he understood how Maxim must feel. The oxen's job was to work every day, day in and day out, week after week with no break. That seemed to be his only purpose in life. And he was a prisoner like Nikolai. He was not his own boss. He couldn't come and go as he pleased. His job was to haul water from the spring, and it probably would be until the day he died. After that first evening visit with Maxim, Nikolai stopped by the stables every night to bring the ox a little something from the kitchen. Sometimes it was a beet or a wedge of cabbage. Sometimes it was just a small carrot. But it was the talks he had with Maxim that helped Nikolai the most. Nikolai was sure that he was getting much more from the visits than Maxim was, but the animal seemed to enjoy the company. The one-sided conversations helped Nikolai deal with the pain of being so far from home. When he felt he was going to panic from the loneliness that threatened to overwhelm him, old Maxim would look at him with his big brown eyes and just listen. And so, a relationship began to grow between Nikolai and Maxim. It was a wonderful tonic for Nikolai's spirit, and it helped him deal with the discouragement of those first few days in the camp. The end of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of the miracle of the seventh day ox. As the week progressed, Nikolai knew the Sabbath problem wasn't going to go away. He was going to have to face it. Several times, he wondered how he should break the news to the warden, but there seemed to be no good way to do it, and no good time either. The warden kept to himself and didn't invite many visitors to his office. One thing was sure, he had Nikolai's file in his office, and sooner or later, it would probably be used against him. The Sabbath hadn't been a specific problem on Nikolai's record. The thing that had gotten him into trouble had been his unwillingness to cooperate with the KGB and give them a list of his church members. But would the Sabbath be a problem now? Nikolai could hardly imagine that it wouldn't, since the warden had reminded him that obeying the camp rules was extremely important. And Nikolai hadn't heard that there were any days off for rest or recreation. As Thursday and then Friday came, Nikolai knew a showdown was imminent. On Sabbath morning, long before the roosters were crowing over in the chicken coop, Nikolai was up, restless and waiting for the will of God to be revealed. "What is it you have in store for me?" Nikolai whispered as he knelt in the early morning shadows of the sod barracks. "I know you want me to be your witness, and I know I may have to suffer for your sake. But how am I to know your plans for me?" But the voice of God was strangely silent, and Nikolai knew that this was one of those times he would simply have to wait for God to lead. When he heard the other prisoners in his barracks begin to stir, he knew the time was fast approaching. And since God had not told him what to do, Nikolai made a decision. He would go out to roll call, but not to breakfast or his work assignment. After roll call, he would return to the barracks to fast and pray. Come what may, this was his decision, and he would stick by it. And that was it. It was as though God had been waiting for Nikolai to make a decision about the Sabbath and then act on it. It was this moment of decision that gave Nikolai the confidence he had been lacking all week. Suddenly, he could see things clearly, as though a window of opportunity had opened. He was standing on the threshold of another great moment in his life. He sensed that things were going to be very hard for him now that he had made this decision, but he wanted to go through with it anyway. After roll call, he did exactly as he had planned. He returned to the barracks, knelt down again on the hard dirt floor by his bunk, and began to pray. And every moment that passed took him closer to the inevitable confrontation he knew was coming. But it didn't come as soon as he had expected, and he should have guessed as much. No one would know that he hadn't shown up for his work assignment except Vadim, and the carpenter might simply think that Nikolai had been asked to work somewhere else for the day. But finally, the moment of truth arrived. About mid-morning, Nikolai heard one of the guards outside talking to another prisoner. "Where's Panchak?" the gravelly voice demanded. "I haven't seen him," came the reply. It was almost noon before Nikolai was finally discovered in the barracks, and when he was, it seemed the whole world was caving in. "What are you doing here?" the guard demanded. "Are you sick?" Nikolai knew that if he said he was sick, they might let him off for the day. But that wouldn't fix the problem. The following week, he would be in the barracks again. And the likelihood of his being sick 2 Sabbaths in a row would certainly be cause for suspicion. Nikolai knew he needed to deal with the Sabbath issue now. He needed to face this problem head on, no matter what the consequences. It was the only way. "I'm not sick," Nikolai said plainly, getting to his feet. "Then why are you in here?" the guard asked incredulously, as though expecting some sort of ridiculous answer. And he got one. "I can't work today because it's the 7th-day Sabbath of the Lord my God." "The 7th-day what?" the guard yelled, standing stock still. "The 7th day is God's holy Sabbath, and I'm forbidden to work on it. The Bible is very—" "The Bible?" Nikolai was cut short by the guard. It was obvious the guard hadn't seen this coming, and it gave Nikolai a chance to take the explanation a bit further. The Bible is God's holy word, and in it, He tells me I should worship on the 7th-day Sabbath in honor of the world's creation. Nikolai would have liked to say more, but he knew that God would never let him finish, and he was right. "I don't know what you're talking about," the God interrupted again, finally getting his bearings. "It doesn't matter what day it is. We work every day around here. On your feet, Panchak. I won't have any slackers in these barracks." But Nikolai made no move to go. And this infuriated the God even more. "I'll teach you to disobey orders," he shouted again, his face turning purple with rage. He pulled a nightstick from his belt and began to beat Nikolai on the head and shoulders. Nikolai didn't have time to do anything but cover his head with his hands and arms. It hurt, but he was able to deflect the worst blows of the beating. "Now get to your work assignment," the guard shouted. "Vadim is looking for you." Both Nikolai and the guard were breathing hard by now, but Nikolai still made no move to go. "I'm sorry, but I can't work," Nikolai repeated the words quietly. "It's forbidden for me to work on God's holy day." At this, the guard let loose with a steady stream of curses and began to beat Nikolai mercilessly with his fists. Then he grabbed Nikolai by his shirt collar and dragged him out the door into the barracks courtyard. By now, the commotion was so great that other prisoners were looking toward them to see what the noise was all about. "We'll see about this seventh-day holy Sabbath of yours," he shouted uncontrollably. "We'll just take you to the warden and see what he says about all this. He'll know what to do with the likes of you." The end of chapter 9 of the miracle of the seventh-day ox. Chapter 10 of the miracle of the seventh-day ox. Moments later, Nikolai was in front of the warden's office. Although he was still standing, he was a sorry sight. His face was beginning to swell from the beating he had received to his head. One eye was turning black. His shirt was almost ripped off, and his hair was all covered with dirt and straw. "What's the meaning of this?" the warden demanded, coming out of his office. When he saw Nikolai, he began to walk round and round him. "He insists he can't work today because it's some kind of holy day," snapped the guard. "A holy day, is it? Well now, Yuri," the warden turned to the guard. "I see you tried to enlighten this man on the ways of our camp. You are to be commended." By now, Nikolai could hardly see through the eye that was swelling shut. He was indeed suffering for the decision he had made to keep God's Sabbath holy. But it didn't matter. This was a small price to pay compared to the suffering that Jesus had endured for Nikolai. What harm could it do to suffer a little for him? The warden turned back to Nikolai. "What have you got to say for yourself, troublemaker?" "It's true," Nikolai admitted. Although he could not see clearly, he stared straight ahead, not looking directly at the warden. "Well, I hope you have learned your lesson." His voice was as smooth as syrup as he came to stand in front of Nikolai. But beneath it all, Nikolai sensed the man could be cruel. "Are you ready to go back to work?" He stood toe-to-toe with the prisoner, his nose barely inches from Nikolai's face. "It's God's holy day. I cannot work on the seventh-day Sabbath." The warden's eyes grew steely cold. "You can't work?" he asked plainly, his voice strangely calm. But Nikolai could tell there was disdain beneath the calm exterior. and he sensed that the worst was yet to come. Not on God's holy day. Is that your final answer? Yes, sir. The consequences will be severe. The warden's voice was still even, but the tension was building. It's my decision, sir. I'm willing to take the punishment. And you will. The warden turned to Yuri with ice in his voice, and he had a cold gleam in his eye. Go get my whip from my office. Strip the preacher to the waist and tie him to the flagpole. We'll see how strong this boy is. Nikolai was brave, but he found it difficult to keep from crying out in pain. The warden did indeed make a spectacle of Nikolai as he beat him mercilessly with the whip. Finally, Nikolai slumped to the ground unconscious, and it was only then that the warden stopped long enough to catch his breath. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and handed the whip to Yuri. Cut him loose. When he comes to, he can find his own way back to the barracks. And with that, the warden went back inside his office. Yuri watched him go, not surprised, but a bit solemn at the display of the warden's fury. It had been a long time since he had seen the warden beat a prisoner like this, and it was a bit disturbing for him to see the warden enjoy it so. He himself had beaten Nikolai just minutes before, but now he realized what anger could do to someone if unchecked. It was a rather strange mixture of feelings, and he was hard-pressed to explain the anger that he and the warden felt toward these prisoners. How long Nikolai lay on the ground, he didn't know. The sun was low in the sky when he finally came to, and he could hardly move. The blood had dried on his back, but the flies were having a feast. After a bit, he finally managed to stand and slowly stagger back to the barracks. When he got there, he collapsed on his bunk and fell into an exhausted sleep. The next day, his back felt like chopped meat, but he managed to get to his feet. He was able to wash the blood from his face, but he couldn't reach his back. His shirt covered the lacerations on his back, but his face was black and blue for all to see. And not surprisingly, the other prisoners avoided him. It was too risky to do otherwise. After all, who would want to befriend a foolish preacher who would rather be horsewhipped than give in to the warden's demands? Any one of them might be considered a sympathizer if they were caught talking to Nikolai. During the next few days, Nikolai grew stronger. The wounds healed, but his courage grew with each day. He had passed the test. He had been strong for Jesus. He had not given in, even though he knew he would suffer for it. As the days passed, the other prisoners still avoided him, but he thought he saw the faint looks of admiration directed toward him. Tuesday came and went, and then Wednesday and Thursday. Nikolai began to think of the coming Sabbath. What would be his fate? Would the warden respect him for his stand on the Sabbath? Would he grant him the privilege to rest as he had asked? Or would it be just the opposite? Would he get another beating for his decision to honor the Sabbath? Unfortunately, Nikolai couldn't see that the worst was still to come, and it was just as well. He needed to grow a bit stronger before Satan's tide of evil would again hit him with all its force. The end of chapter 10 Chapter 11 of the Miracle of the Seventh-day Ox. All week, Nikolai worried about what would happen on Sabbath morning. He knew he shouldn't worry, but he dreaded what might be coming next. He thought he would be willing to take more of the same treatment he had already received, but his wounds hadn't healed yet from the warden's initial horsewhipping. If he was whipped again, the wounds would just open up again, and he could only imagine what the pain would be like then. By Friday night, though, his faith was strong, and he was determined to stand for God and face whatever was in store for him tomorrow. If God would give him the courage and the strength to go on, Nikolai was determined to be faithful to God no matter what happened. Sabbath dawned cool and clear. Nikolai didn't know how early he had awakened. He didn't have a watch, but he could tell by the snoring in the barracks that it was early, well before the usual time to rise. Because of the lacerations and bruises on his back, Nikolai had been sleeping on his stomach, but now he rolled out of bed and onto his knees. Please, Lord, he prayed, let me be worthy of the persecution that might come my way today. I know it's a small thing compared to what you did for me, but I'll gladly do it. How long he stayed on his knees, he couldn't say. But suddenly, Yuri's gravelly voice was waking everyone in the barracks as though it were Judgment Day. On your feet, men! Out of those beds! Yuri gave a few of the beds a jarring kick, sending prisoners flying out of them in a hurry. Nikolai jumped to his feet too, but not before Yuri noticed him. Well now, Panchuk, it's nice to see that we're not going to have any foolishness this morning. I can see that you have come to your senses. Nikolai smiled weakly but said nothing. He knew trouble was already on its way. But what should he say? No matter what he said, the whole thing was going to blow up in his face. All the soldiers filed out into the morning sunshine and waited for their orders after roll call. The officer in charge of camp maintenance and repairs read down through a list of the tasks for the day. Several of the prisoners in Nikolai's barracks were to work with a crew that would be helping to butcher some reindeer meat brought in the day before. The dozen or so animals had somehow split off from a larger herd and had migrated west towards the camp, where the guards spotted them through field glasses. Other prisoners were sent to cut new sod to build yet another barracks that was soon to go up. It had been rumored that another batch of prisoners would be coming in next month, and the current barracks were already bursting to overflow. And Pancha, Yuri declared, looking straight at Nikolai, you are to report to Vadim immediately after breakfast. He needs to do some roof repairs on the mess hall. Nikolai looked straight ahead. The moment he feared most had arrived. And of course, he wasn't surprised. Would the confrontations and beatings start all over again? Well, what are you waiting for? Yuri demanded as Nikolai looked straight ahead and didn't offer to move. He opened his mouth to speak, but then closed it again. What was the use? They were going to mistreat him anyway, no matter what he said. But then he remembered his promise to God that he would speak for the Lord wherever he was sent or in whatever he was asked to do. Nikolai took a deep breath. I can't work today because it's the seventh-day Sabbath of the Lord my God. The guard's face took on a shocked look of exasperation, but then turned to annoyance. Preacher man, you have got to be kidding, he blurted. The other prisoners stared at Nikolai and shook their heads silently. Yuri finally overcame his silence and snorted. So you have decided to be stupid again, have you? Well, we'll see about that. He grabbed Nikolai by the arm and marched him off to the warden's office, then left him standing in the hallway just outside the imposing doorway. Nikolai finally dredged up enough courage to knock on the door. Maybe the warden wasn't in, Nikolai hoped. Maybe he was busy doing something more important. But soon the door opened, and when the warden saw Nikolai, a look of disbelief crossed his face. "What do you want, Panchak?" He shook his head pathetically. "Don't tell me you've decided to be stubborn again?" The warden came right to the point. It was as if he had somehow known all along that Nikolai would refuse to work again come Saturday, but had never really allowed himself to imagine it. Nikolai opened his mouth to speak again, but the warden cut him off. "All right, if that's the way you want it, come with me." He stood to his feet, stepped through the open doorway, and then down the short hallway. Nikolai stood rooted to the spot as he watched the warden go. The end of chapter 11 of The Miracle of the Seventh-day Ox, the story of Nikolai Panchak, an SDA pastor imprisoned in Siberia for his faith.